8 years ago, my in-laws insisted that I sign a prenuptial agreement because, in their eyes, I did not measure up financially. They were convinced I was too poor for their daughter, and so this prenuptial contract became their way of protecting what they believed was rightfully hers. At that time, it stung me deeply because it served as yet another indication that I was unwelcome in their family. I was keenly aware of how they regarded me, and having to sign something like that only reinforced my sense of not belonging. They made it seem like their acceptance of me hinged upon this document, which was humiliating in itself, especially since I was already doing all I could to build a secure and promising future. I had been working in sales when I met my wife, and we were both 27 years old at the time. After spending 1 year together, I decided to quit my job and start my own electronics brand. I had been harboring that dream for a while, determined to create something of my own, and my wife was my greatest supporter throughout this process. By the time I officially launched my business, I was nearly 28, and although it was a challenging road, she cheered me on every step of the way, sharing in my excitement whenever I reached a milestone. In contrast, her parents were not nearly as thrilled. They viewed me as someone who was sponging off her financial support because I did not have a steady income at that moment. Admittedly, she did help me cover expenses while I was trying to get my brand off the ground, but it was never as though I relied on her for everything. I had my own savings, and I simply appreciated her willingness to ease some of the burdens that come with starting a new venture. When I turned 29, I decided to propose. We got married within the year, but a few months before the wedding, her parents summoned me and insisted that I sign a prenup. According to its terms, all assets and money would remain separate in the event of a divorce, and I would not have the right to lay claim to any of her possessions, nor would she be able to claim mine. Furthermore, I would be responsible for repaying her and her parents for the times they contributed financially during my early business days. This part felt like a constant reminder that I was somehow in their debt. I believe they only added the clause preventing my wife from claiming my property to make it seem more fair, but it was really a strategy to demonstrate that they didn't trust me. Another clause detailed that even if we opened a joint account, the funds would be split based on each person's contribution, reflecting their assumption that I would continue relying on my wife's money for most of our marriage. They told me that signing this agreement was the only way they would feel comfortable accepting me into the family, which cut quite deep because it implied they never saw me as an equal partner to their daughter. I felt insulted for multiple reasons. First, they immediately assumed I would forever be dependent on my wife and would never become successful on my own, even though, at the time, I was actively working to develop my electronics business. I wanted to ensure that neither she nor anyone else would need to support me indefinitely, but apparently, my in-laws believed otherwise. Second, they had disliked me even before I left my sales job, from the moment they first laid eyes on me when my wife introduced me to them. Their disdain boiled down to a single factor: I wasn't wealthy enough. My wife comes from a family that owns a successful real estate firm, and all of them have enjoyed a financially comfortable lifestyle. Meanwhile, my upbringing was ordinary. My father was a high school football coach, and my mother managed a local coffee shop. Although I didn't struggle financially as a child, I certainly didn't have the affluence they had. From the beginning, they bombarded me with subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, jabs, condescending jokes, and a general air of superiority that made it clear they did not consider me good enough for their daughter. Despite all of this, I remained silent. I never retorted their snide remarks because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing they were ruffling my feathers. My wife, on the other hand, was upset by how they spoke to me, but I insisted we ignore it. Our relationship was between us, and we didn't need anyone else's approval, even her parents. Still, signing the prenup felt like an undeniable slap in the face. Even so, I discussed it with my wife, and we agreed we would go through with it because their pettiness was not a reason for us to postpone or cancel our wedding. It was clear they were trying to test me, to see if I would back down. Perhaps they hoped to sabotage the wedding so they could steer their daughter towards someone more acceptable in their eyes. But they failed because my wife and I are a team and have remained so through countless trials. Over the years, my business began to grow. I persevered, pouring my energy into improving and promoting it. About 2 years ago, things really took off, and my sales soared, largely thanks to strategic social media marketing and an unwavering commitment to the brand. It was a thrilling time for both my wife and me. Unexpectedly, my personal net worth skyrocketed to a point where I was worth approximately 5 times as much as my in-laws. Suddenly, my in-laws seemed very interested in erasing the prenuptial agreement, even though they had fought so hard to have it drafted in the first place. A couple of days ago, they dropped by for dinner, and once our son was tucked into bed, they asked my wife and me to sit down. They announced that they'd been pondering the situation deeply and decided it was time to consult their lawyers about dissolving the prenup. My wife and I were both taken aback, her more visibly than me, but it only took me a moment to gather my wits and decline. I told them I saw no need for such a change, reminding them that this contract had originally been their primary source of comfort in accepting me into the family. Through a tone that dripped with sarcasm, I asserted I did not want to rob them of that safety net. They realized I was ridiculing them, but tried to argue that because so many years had passed and we now had a child together, there was no longer any basis for their doubts. I still refused. I saw no logical reason to make changes at that point. This was when they got agitated, claiming that I should honor their request since the prenup had been their idea in the first place, and they were older, more seasoned in life, so I should follow their judgment. They believed it was necessary to prevent bitterness between us in the future. I genuinely had no idea what they were talking about. If anything, letting the prenup remain would prevent any suspicion from arising. They persisted in pressuring me until it escalated into a full-blown argument. Years of pent-up frustration surfaced, and I finally confronted them about how they designed the prenup primarily to demean me, knowing I earned far less than them at the time. Now that I have surpassed them financially, they wanted to brush the past under the rug. Their rebuttal was that they only did it to secure their daughter's future, so that if I ended up being a husband who married her only for money, she would be safeguarded. It turned into a frenzy of hurling accusations back and forth. Before long, the dispute grew too exhausting for me, and I told them I'd had enough. It was late, my son was sleeping, and I wanted peace of mind. I asked them to leave. They were outraged, insisting that the only reason I achieved my current success was because of their and their daughter's financial contributions in the beginning. They implied I had never truly stood on my own. But from my viewpoint, they contributed funds primarily for their daughter's sake, not mine. Indeed, I appreciated any assistance I received, but the intent behind it was not altruistic, more like an obligation they felt toward her. Whenever my wife fell short on household expenses, she requested their help, and they would send money, typically out of reluctance to see their own daughter struggle. It had little to do with genuinely supporting my ambitions. Emotionally, they provided no backing at all and never treated me like a family member. So I saw no justification for them to claim that I only thrived because of them, and hearing that accusation stirred deep resentment. When I voiced my stance on the matter, they interpreted it as ingratitude. The argument escalated into louder shouting, culminating in them pressuring my wife to pick a side, either me or them. Realizing their efforts were going nowhere, my wife managed to usher them out of the house. By then, tension was searing the air, and we hadn't arrived at any resolution. After they left, we learned they were trying to manipulate my wife by encouraging her to divorce me. My wife was deeply shaken when she read their messages. She had been working tirelessly to defuse the situation because our son absolutely adores his grandparents, and she didn't want any more disruptions in the family. On some level, I felt the same way. We never wanted to bar them from our son's life, but the texts were infuriating. They showed no remorse for the way they had belittled me over the years, and they flat out refused to accept they had done any wrong. Instead, they painted me as ungrateful, highlighting how they supposedly helped us financially at the outset. They now suggested that my wife should consider walking away from me because, in their twisted reasoning, I was disrespectful, never showed appreciation for their generosity. And I had further proved my distrust by refusing to dissolve the prenup. It was nothing but absurd insinuations designed to plant seeds of doubt in her mind, presumably hoping she would do as they asked and file for divorce. Fortunately, she saw right through this manipulation. She only thought they made a mildly fair point about contributing money in our early years together, during which I had no regular income. Even so, I remain reluctant to thank them for it because they never really did it for my benefit. It was all for their daughter. If she had allowed me to, I would have dug into my personal savings to handle expenses during that time, thereby eliminating the need for any external contribution. But my wife felt more comfortable accepting help from them, assuming they wouldn't mind since they had enough resources to spare. Meanwhile, they never failed to show their condescension, constantly implying I was a freeloader. For that reason, I endure conflicting emotions about the gratitude they expect. They never once welcomed me warmly, and I'm convinced I have already dealt with more than enough negativity to justify refusing to acknowledge any so-called debt toward them. So, I wonder, am I the bad guy for standing firm and refusing to be visibly appreciative of my in-laws' early financial help? In truth, I have no real objection to removing the prenup. The timing, however, is suspicious. Not long ago, my wife and I made substantial purchases, both in my name. Neither of us minded because we trust each other and know our bond is strong. We argue sometimes, but it's never been about money, and we do not plan on divorcing. Yet, my in-laws decided right now was the moment to push for changing the agreement. It's suspicious because they have never stopped doubting me. They perpetually question my intentions and act like I don't have my wife's best interests at heart. Even after all this time, it's glaringly evident that they haven't truly embraced me as a family member, and that is where the crux of my issue lies. I've never repaid them outright because, until now, I never felt I owed them anything beyond basic civility. I presumed that since my business has thrived and my wife hasn't had to pay for anything in ages, the scales were balanced. If they genuinely believe I owe them a specific sum, I'm completely open to settling it. I have no problem writing them a check if that means they will finally stop using this topic as leverage against me. Update 1. It's been a week since the big confrontation with my in-laws, and I've made up my mind to return all the money they gave us in those early days. I even have a rough figure in mind, an amount I consider close to what they contributed. I'm in a position to comfortably repay it now, and the thought of freeing myself from their hold is appealing. No more illusions of being indebted to them, no more feeling obligated to worship the ground they walk on. I discussed it with my wife, and she believes it's a sound approach, primarily because her parents are still pressuring her to divorce me, citing my repeated disrespect toward them. They conveniently ignore that they have spent years insulting me, and by extension, my loved ones. I see their behavior as the height of hypocrisy. They can dish it out freely, but the moment someone calls them on it or responds in kind, they scream about being mistreated. I can only maintain civility for so long. Eventually, one has to push back. By reimbursing every cent, I can move forward with no lingering sense of obligation. They never offered me genuine emotional backing, nor did they try to give the impression that they genuinely accepted me. So, if writing a check removes one more thing they can weaponize, then I'm all for it. Usually, I wouldn't try to fix a family rift with money, but with them, materialistic concerns seem to be the linchpin of every interaction. It's unfathomable to me that they'd go as far as jeopardizing their own daughter's marriage, and the stability of their grandson's home, just to satisfy their egos. This entire ordeal underscores how twisted their priorities truly are. Update 2. Earlier today, my wife informed her parents that I was prepared to reimburse them. She explained that we both found this situation exhausting and felt that maybe returning the money would finally bring peace, as it was the root cause of this ongoing feud. Alas, this didn't solve anything. They took offense at the mere suggestion that money could buy them off. They insisted the real issue had nothing to do with finances. This contradicted how they behaved during the argument, where it very much appeared that finances were their main concern. Now, they claim it's about the respect that I supposedly never showed them. From my perspective, respect is a two-way street, and they have offered me no such consideration in all these years. My wife and I are completely dumbfounded by their stance because I have consistently treated them civilly, despite them belittling me almost non-stop. They're now equating my single refusal to lavish them with gratitude for their financial contributions with the years of hostility they have shown me and my family. The scale is hardly balanced. My wife even concedes they've exaggerated how much they supported us. Regardless, I was fully prepared to settle any outstanding debts, so now there is no logical basis for their complaint. Since they are not speaking directly to me at the moment, only communicating through my wife, they continue to harangue her about why she should leave me. They persist in trying to manipulate her, urging her to think about our son and make me look like an unfit husband and father who lacks the fundamental decency to respect family. They believe it's prudent for her to get a divorce while it's still not too late, but it's appalling. This has strengthened my resolve that I cannot maintain a normal relationship with them. Their hostility has taken an unbelievably cruel turn. They are practically demanding that she not only divorce me but also seek custody of our son, all to spite me. They've shown time and time again that they never wanted me in the family and will go to extreme lengths to push me out. Update 3. Over 2 weeks have passed since the initial blow-up, and my wife stopped replying to her parents' calls and messages after feeling she had reached the end of her rope. They showed no intention of compromising or recognizing our perspective. Seeing that she wasn't responding, they decided to appear unannounced at our home. I answered the door, and they breezed past me without even acknowledging my presence, calling out for my wife. I wasn't surprised by their rudeness anymore. It's par for the course. Eventually, my wife came to see what the commotion was about, and she made it clear she wouldn't speak to them unless they acknowledged our side of the issue. But instead of meeting her halfway, they berated her for emulating me, claiming she was becoming just as disrespectful as I allegedly am. They further insisted that if I owed them any gratitude, so did she. That instantly made her furious, and she let them know, in no uncertain terms, that she was their daughter, not some stranger they could hold a debt over. They weren't forced to help her, and plenty of parents financially assist their children without using it as leverage. Had they wanted to keep their money, they could have declined in the first place. At the end of the day, they chose to offer it, and then wave it in her face later. Both of us had tried to show them courtesy in spite of their frequent jabs, mostly to keep the peace. But now, every last shred of patience was gone, and my wife's tolerance for their manipulation had reached its limit. Throughout this altercation, I stayed in the background, not wanting to escalate the drama. But when my wife started to get overwhelmed, I stood beside her to show support. This enraged my in-laws. They doubled down on their attacks, blaming me for igniting all of this by refusing to abolish the prenup. I corrected them by pointing out that the conflict really began the moment they decided to treat me poorly just because I didn't come from wealth. They never wanted their daughter to be with someone who wasn't on equal financial footing from the start. I had tolerated their remarks for years, silently enduring their negativity. My refusal to dissolve the prenup was merely me expressing that I would no longer capitulate to their demands. Infuriated that they couldn't provoke me into a meltdown, they declared my wife should choose between them and me. Without missing a beat, she said she was choosing her true family, her husband and son. She demanded they leave and informed them they'd be receiving a check soon. After that, they'd be completely cut off from our lives. Her parents seemed stunned, probably believing we would relent as we had in the past. But we had reached our breaking point. When they refused to leave, my wife threatened to call the police, which finally made them exit. Immediately after, we blocked their numbers and resolved to cut ties with them completely. It will be difficult explaining to our son why his grandparents are no longer around, but fortunately, he has another set of grandparents, my parents, who adore him endlessly. Perhaps one day, there might be room for forgiveness or reconciliation, but that day isn't on the horizon. My wife and I have tried our hardest for years to keep the relationship cordial, letting their endless barbs slide to preserve family harmony. Their choice to sabotage our marriage and potentially hurt our son's well-being, for reasons tied to ego, money, and their bizarre sense of pride, has forced us to prioritize our family's peace above all else. I'm relieved we finally addressed what had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. Taking a stand has given both of us a renewed sense of unity and closure. We can now move forward, knowing we did everything possible to mend the situation, and it was my in-laws who persistently refused to accept us on any terms but their own.